All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, really is a huge pleasure to be with you. I was in India just before the pandemic hit. I left at the end of January in 2020. By the time I got back to Milan, which is my home at the moment, we had probably the first serious outbreak in the West, so it's a thrill to be back. And it's especially fun to be back in India at a time when many things are going well. And India is the highest potential. Sorry? Okay. Maybe the AV people can turn it up. India, among the major economies in the world, is the one with the highest potential growth. And it looks like the actual performance is at least pretty close to potential. So what I'm going to do today, I wrote a book with Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of Britain, and my friend Mohammed Al-Arian it was called Permacrisis. And it was an attempt to try to bring into focus a pretty complex environment that we're living in globally, in which at least three things are going on. One of them is this persistent, increasingly frequent severe shocks in the form of crises, pandemics, wars, climate shocks, and so on, some of them financial if you go back a little bit in time. And so that's one set. Second set is some very large secular, meaning not cyclical, structural changes in the economy that we argue are major headwinds to growth. These include declining productivity, aging in 78% of the global economy in terms of GDP. I know that may sound a little strange when you live in a country that's as young as this one, but the young countries have roughly two-thirds of the world's population, but about 22% of its GDP at this point. Now, 20 years from now, this picture may look very different, depending on who grows and by how much. But that's the situation now. And there are many more headwinds. So we thought there was lots to talk about, but we didn't want it to be depressing. And at least the way I see the world, the third major set of things that are going on that are relevant, powerful forces, are a set of scientific and technological transformations underway. And the three that I talk about in the book are the digital one, multi-decade, many chapters, not finished by any means. A somewhat less discussed, but nevertheless very powerful revolution in biomedical and life sciences. And then this huge energy transition that we are going to have to go through in order to achieve sustainable patterns of growth in the future. So that's kind of, if I had half a day of your time, that's what I would talk about, but I don't. So I'm going to talk about the last part, and in particular about the digital part, and even more specifically about artificial intelligence. And so let me spend a few minutes doing that, because I think it'll be a lot more fun for you when we engage in conversation about this with each other, and then eventually with all of you. Now let me see if I can make this thing. Well, that's interesting. Does the arrow going that way mean forward? So these are the major transformations I just mentioned. There's a fourth, which is actually economics. It's the growth of the emerging economies, populations mostly in East and South Asia, shift to the center of gravity of the global economy to Asia. And this has, easy to say, enormously important implications, the distribution of power, an influence in the global economy, the rise of tensions, as the rising powers challenge the dominance of the, incumbent, et cetera. But that's not what we're doing today. So what I'm going to do is show you at least, I have a long list of, and this is by way of preface, of scientific sort of tools and technology tools that are path-breaking, but more importantly, from the point of view of the way our economies perform, they are increasingly widely available and their costs are plummeting by like a stone. And there are a lot of them. I'm going to show you only a few. But the point of this is that the human capital of the world is increasingly being handed a set of incredibly powerful tools to alter growth patterns, to accelerate productivity, to accelerate progress in biomedical science, et cetera. Now, you know, I didn't want to sort of take an aside and take you through all those. This is one, obviously. This is TSMC's semiconductor map. If you have an iPhone in your pocket, it's a 5-nanometer chip. There's probably 2 entities in the world that can make those right now. It's not a very stable situation. If I had more time, I'll tell you. There's another number up there, up on the right-hand side, here. This is a 3-nanometer chip. And then there's a number under it, and that number is 291. And what that number is the number of transistors, read switches, in millions per square millimeter on the chip. This is really hard to understand how powerful these things are, and I think it's fair to say we're not done. I'll spend a minute on this, because I don't know how many of you have followed AI closely over lots of years. I would say 15 years ago, the current version of AI, based on a kind of analogy with the way the brain works, neural networks, you know, deep algorithms that pick off patterns and so on, was available in theory. But there were 3 things missing: enough digital data, enough networks to move that data around so it was accessible in fast networks, and most importantly, the computing power to implement those models. So let's drop back. The previous version of artificial intelligence was actually quite influential if you look at the way the digital economy impacted society, but it was essentially a dead end. So we've had lots of impacts on economies that have the following characteristic. Humans know how to do something, property 1, and property 2, we can describe in precise logical steps how we do them. If we can do that, then we can code them, and we have, and then we'll let the machine do it. That's why we don't have file clerks anymore, at least in the developed countries, et cetera. This led to the hollowing out of the middle class, the elimination of routine white and blue-collar jobs. This has all been well documented, right? But in AI, which is an attempt in some sense to reproduce what humans do, the reason that hit a dead end was because there's many things we do, property 1, where we cannot satisfy property 2. That is, we cannot write down precisely how we do it. We just do it. So everybody in this room can, you know, look at a chair and recognize it's a chair. But I send the students home in the course and I say, if you want to understand this, then the assignment is come back here with a piece of paper and a checklist. It can have conditionals and all kinds of things in it that if we coded it with a computer, the computer plausibly could recognize a chair and not make type 1 and type 2 errors. You can't do that. Just can't. There's just millions and millions of different forms of chairs. Any list like that, and you can find a counterexample. And it became just transparently obvious that that's not what we're doing when we're identifying objects, whatever they are. And then along comes powerful computing of high-speed networks and digital transformation and the neural network technology, and that's what we're seeing on this graph. So we've had a whole sequence of breakthroughs that combined, I think, are going to transform pretty much everything. And if you don't believe me, that's because I won't have convinced you in the next few minutes. So we had handwriting recognition, speech recognition, translation. It went from truly dreadful to awful. Fast forward, Gen AI can probably now, for a multilingual country, take a newspaper written in any of its languages and produce the digital edition in very high quality form in all its remaining languages at zero marginal cost. Zero. Okay? Think about it, right? What it means in terms of communication, et cetera. And that's just one tiny corner of what it might be able to do. In the middle here is a thing called image recognition. That's the black line. And that was a really impressive thing. This is the case that I gave you with the chair. And we were trying to solve this problem, or the technologists were, with the old technology, and it failed. And they adopted the new technology, and it improved at incredible speed. And around 2015, 2016, the AI passed the average human performance. So let me pause there. We benchmark AIs against human performance. Seems like a perfectly natural thing to do, especially given the name artificial intelligence, where they're trying to reproduce us. And Alan Turing, the famous author, basically, of the computer, they proposed that we test our advance in artificial intelligence by asking the following question: can we produce a machine that when a human interacts with that machine, the human thinks they're interacting with another human? So that's perfectly natural sort of stretch goal. Benchmarking is a perfectly natural way to assess progress, although I do want to flag for the later discussion, there are AIs that are superhuman by orders of magnitude in areas you can imagine when you have to scan mountains and mountains of data or do unbelievably large amounts of calculations. There are places where they're about the same as us on average, maybe not as good as the experts. And there are places where they're not quite up to human standards. All of them have their uses. When I'm teaching a course on this stuff, I talk to the students and tell them how we benchmark this. And then I say, well, turns out with a bit of effort, you can use image recognition to recognize skin cancers, but really isn't as good as the dermatologists. And so then I say, well, what do you think of that? And they say, well, it's not very interesting. I mean, it was a nice try, but we failed. And I say, are you sure? And they say, yeah. I wouldn't use this. I'm just going to the dermatologist. And I say, 85% of the world's population lives nowhere near a dermatologist. Okay? And this, used properly, and by the way, you can take pictures of your skin with your phone, can give you a warning sign under the heading preventive primary care, which will cause you to ride 85 kilometers in a train inconveniently and get yourself checked. But with this is signaling, with the signal that there's actually a shift in the probabilities and you have a problem, okay? So I would say the discourse around AI at the moment is still very unsophisticated. And the notion that, they're very important inclusive growth pattern type uses, whether they're in education or healthcare or other dimensions of the economy, that are available to us in all of these categories, this full range of human relative AI performance in compared to humans. But the benchmarking of AIs, anticipating something I want to say in a few minutes, has one very, very serious spillover effect, and that is there is a natural, very strong human tendency to say, well, once the AI passes the human, why don't we get rid of the human? And that's what I call the automation bias. And you can find it everywhere. When you listen to people talk, are there going to be enough jobs? Is my job going to go away? Hospital administrator starts talking about AI, and there's panic. There's literally terror. But when you go and look at it, there's a certain amount of automation involved in shifting jobs around, parts of jobs, really. But it's not the natural use of these things. They're prediction machines. They hallucinate if you allow them to. They make stuff up. They get stuff wrong. They don't know the answers to certain things. Lawyers can use them to write a draft brief. Doctors can surely use them to write the first draft of the very time-consuming reports they have to hand in. I'm not talking about large language models. Computer code, the first draft can be written with these things easily now. I mean, this isn't, futuristic stuff. But the doctor's not going to hand in the first draft without checking it. And a lawyer did hand in the brief in the United States. The only problem with the brief was that all the legal precedents that were cited didn't exist. So this gentleman's in serious trouble. We probably, there'll be a little learning like this, and we won't have many mistakes of this kind going forward. But anyway, it's just a caution, right? We got lock onto this. My belief is, at least for a period of time, the natural use of this as a powerful digital assistant or a collaborator to both people doing various things at work or even not at work, and to systems. Now, this one is starting to be talked about, but you probably won't have read very much about it. But you can look into global supply chains, which are opaque and complex with AI systems, that in a way that no human can. We just can't keep track of it. This is superhuman category. Anyway, so the last set of things here are this growing generation of AI models that are available to us. Large language models, increasing number of parameters. So ChatGPT-4 would be, I don't know exact number, but it's multiple billions of parameters that enable it to do what it does. They'll become multimodal, meaning they'll handle images, text, poetry, video, interchangeably in the not-too-distant future. Why? This is image recognition. It was a process led by a colleague of ours at MIT named Fei-Fei Li. I'm going to this is sort of an aside, and it does have to do with biology, but it's the intersection of powerful digital technologies, AIs, with biology. So you probably know these folks called DeepMind. It's part of Alphabet because they're the ones who got a computer to win the game of Go. And the game of Go has the property that the number of permutations of the way the board can be laid out is so large you can't catalog it. Certainly not, maybe with quantum computing, certainly not now. That was very successful, and there was a great deal of learning because the second round of playing the game of Go, the machine, they didn't basically tell it anything other than the rules, and the machine played against itself. And it discovered things that humans hadn't thought of. It's a kind of creativity, These are unconventional moves that they would make, and the experts would look and say, what? Nobody ever does it. Man, turns out some of them it discovered were worth it. Their next project was called AlphaFold, and I'm going to do this briefly. And they set out, for reasons that you can probably guess, to predict the three-dimensional structure of proteins from the amino acid sequence that defines a protein. And the reason that's important is because A, it takes a lot of time in the lab, and B, if you don't know the three-dimensional configuration of a molecule, you have no idea what it'll bind to. You can't produce drugs, vaccines, et cetera. It's a core bit of technology in biomedical science and pharmaceuticals. And they succeeded. It was to everybody's astonishment. After a couple of years of hard work, this system now makes a reasonably good prediction. Think of it as the first guess, okay, starting point of the structure of protein. And then they did an interesting thing. They took the 200 million known proteins in the world, predicted their structures, and published it in an open source document that's available for free for anybody in the world. Okay? Now just think about it, right? Core technology in biological research, available at no cost to the tons of creative and talented, innovative people working in these fields. I mean, if you're a biologist, this is productivity improvement, on steroids. DNA sequencing costs, I like this one just because it's interesting. So DNA sequencing costs are coming down like a lot of these other costs, properly calculated. Followed Moore's law. You all know what Moore's law is. It's the intertemporal pattern of semiconductor power. And then it deviated from Moore's law and started dropping like a stone. So the original cost, I don't know, was $10 million. It's now $250 per sequence, core technology. not so expensive that, it's accessible. And I'll skip over these. These are the two women who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for discovering gene editing, another incredibly powerful and dangerous technology. And these are the recipients of the Nobel Prize this year in medicine and physiology. And these are the two who discovered basically the mRNA technology that lies behind the successful vaccines and a great deal of the targeted immunotherapy that's being used experimentally in cancer treatment successfully. And that's a global explosion. So let's close my introductory remarks with a few comments on why I think the Gen AI in particular is transformational. First of all, it's not very old. This breakthrough came from a paper that was written at Google by people who were at Google in 2017. For non-technology people like me, it's kind of hard to read. It's full of acronyms, but it is transformational. And so the question is, what effect is it going to have? And so I want to just leave you with simple propositions. I think it's going to produce an enormous surge in productivity. Not tomorrow, not the next day, but long term in virtually everywhere in the economy, subject to certain conditions. So I wrote a paper to that effect with James Monique at Google, and it sort of lays out the argument. And the argument's pretty simple. One, this is the first generation of AI that has what you might call domain switching capabilities, human-like domain switching capabilities. What do I mean by that? It means you can talk to it about a subject like the Italian Renaissance, and then you can change the subject to inflation and economics. And then you can ask it to write computer code, and you don't have to tell it that you're switching domains. It just knows, right? So that's one. And the second thing is you don't need any technical training to use it. Think of the large language models. You just ask it a question. This is completely different in both respects from all previous generations of AI. And so the combination of accessibility and apparent applicability, regardless what the subject matter is, and it looks like a platform on which you can find applications and use cases pretty much everywhere in the economy. And that's been my experience, customer service, writing first drafts, coding, peering into things, nurses' assistants, just a powerful digital assistant working alongside you. Are we going to have a whole lot of automation? No, I don't think so. Depends. It's a little bit semantics, right? So take the doctor case. The AI is writing the first draft to this report this, individual has to write every day. If you define the task as the first draft, yes, it's automation. The machine's doing it and saving the doctor 80% of the report writing time. If you define the task as the report in its final form, then it's machine-human collaboration. You see what I mean? You can tie yourself in knots on the semantics, without kind of thinking very clearly about this. But I do believe the natural model, at least for a while, given the state of these technologies and their probable rapid advancement, is exactly this. Now we're in a period of intense experimentation and exploration. We'll stay in that state. What James and I are concerned about are really three things. One, avoiding the automation bias, this natural tendency to think, well, we should go around and try to find the jobs we can get rid of. That's a terrible way to use this. And it isn't even the best way. The second one is, it's not right to assume that this technology will diffuse widely. If you're going to get the productivity surge, it's not good enough that it has a big impact in the tech sector and finance, right? Because there are a lot of people working somewhere else in the economy. You need it to diffuse across the economy, and that means across sectors that tend to lead and lag, if historical experience in digital adoption tells us anything, and across a wide range of organizations, nonprofits, small and medium-sized businesses, and not all of them have either the knowledge or the resources to do what J.P. Morgan Chase is doing now, which is, throwing a lot of money at trying to figure out how to use this. And this is a role for public policy, right? Whenever you have big structural change, it's usually unwise to write the government out of the script, and this would be a good example of that, where you need a creative. The third thing we say in the paper, for those of you who are interested, it's in Foreign Affairs, in the last issue last year, is the policy agenda around this right now is heavily tipped toward the negative side effects of this, to risks, to misuse, to flooding the system with rubbish, you know, to privacy issues, to, well, what are we going to do with copyright problems? I mean, the large language models just go around the internet hoovering up pretty much everything, including things people have written, creative things, and so on. And the people, and the people in Hollywood are right to say, is this okay, right? You know, what are its long-run consequences? We have to sort those things out. So there's a big agenda on the regulatory side. But if that's all there is, we're going to skip the positive side, or the government's role and the policy role on the positive side in the area of accessibility and diffusion. So we were simply trying to lean a little bit against the bias in the direction of the negative. It's pretty natural right now, I would say. I understand that first of all, part of the negative agenda is, seriously there, and another part is perceptual, the kind of, we won't have enough jobs. I'll close for a lot of you know a fair amount of economics. So let me talk about jobs specifically. So you get a big productivity increase, even if it's not flat-out automation, okay? Well, if the demand, doesn't rise somehow, you probably will reduce the number of jobs. And I have no doubt there's parts of the economy, sectors, where that'll happen. I'd be willing to bet a little bit of money anyway that the number of people writing media copy 10 years from now will be smaller than the number that are writing now. If there's a whole bunch of people taking newspapers and magazines in one language and translating them laboriously into another, they probably won't be doing that. If what we just said about the AI's ability to do that extremely well is right. So then the question is, well, is the demand fixed or not, right? And the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. I mean, relatively inelastic is the term we use in economics. So the one that gets people's attention is software engineering. So there's going to be a huge productivity increase in software engineering because it's writing the first draft code. And I think everybody acknowledges that. It's already happening. And so the question is, do we need fewer software engineers? And the instinctive answer sometimes comes back, yes. But then you think about it. We're building entire economies essentially on software platforms. And so the notion that, we aren't going to need an awful lot of software, even with higher productivity and lower costs of development, seems to me at least something that you'd probably want to put a question mark over before you, jump to that conclusion. So beyond that, we can't get. We're just going to have to go down the road and figure it out. But there will be disruption and distributional consequences, and it'll be important not to ignore them, because some people in various job classes will be sideswiped. It's just probably at the macro level, we're not going to end up short of jobs. This is my best guess. That's enough from me. Well, no, maybe one more thing, okay? This is a really wonderful study. It was published last June by McKinsey Global Institute. And it's called The Economic Potential of Generative AI, and it has relatively conservative estimates of the impact in economic impacts, and they're very large. With conservative, assumptions about the footprint of Gen AI in the economy, you get figures like $4.4 trillion. I mean, they're just very, very large. And finally, there is a study done by my colleague at Stanford, Eric Brynjolfsson's head of the Digital Economy Lab, and I'll try to summarize, and some co-authors in MIT. And basically what they did is they found an organization, actually two, a consulting organization and a tech organization that was implementing AI in a customer service context. So this is tech-oriented products. Customer service people are helping customers deal with problems like I can't connect to the network or something. And what they did basically is take tens and tens of thousands of hours of audio recordings of customer service, customer interactions with performance measures like, did they solve the problem, or did the customer think they solved the problem? How long did it take? That sort of thing. Some, you know, more, did they make the customer angry? That kind of thing. And then after they trained the algorithm, they gave it to half the customer service agents and not to the other half. And they were careful to give it to, on each side, you know, have it, not have it, a spectrum of customer service agents by experience, right? So that there's a learning curve here, as you would imagine. And the experienced ones tend to do better, just even without an AI assistant. And then they looked at the results, and they're simply stated that productivity increase overall was 14%. It was nearly instantaneous. And the productivity increase for the least experienced people was 35%, because they didn't have to go down the learning curve. The AI had figured it out by examining all these interactions. So essentially what it learned is what the experienced agents had learned through a more laborious process and then delivered it in a usable form to the under. So this is a kind of leveling up effect. I don't know, you know, how general it's going to be, but I think it's not an uninteresting phenomenon in distributional terms. And that really is enough for me. Thank you very much.
Is a professor of economics. And the question I want to ask him is that, do you get a Nobel Prize in economics when you can communicate this simply and clearly? Is that the benchmark? So that was wonderful. That was really wonderful. Because you were talking about artificial intelligence and then economics, which is not something that is, let's call it, easy. Mm. Yeah. So you said many things, and you talked about how software engineers, and the moment you utter the phrase software engineers in this city, hearts and minds are aflutter. Mm. And you said, well, why should we believe that software engineers, the number of their jobs will go down, right? And then you also mentioned that your guess is that the overall number of jobs will perhaps not go down, right? Right. Can you describe that a bit? Why are you hopeful? Why are you hopeful about that?
Yeah, so let me try to answer that. It's a very good question. Try to answer that in a kind of slightly modulated way, okay? So when I didn't describe to you the headwinds to growth and the supply side constraints, one of them, when you look at the advanced economies, especially the United States economy, is we have labor shortages everywhere, including in all the major employment sectors. And the older folks are retiring at a great rate, and the younger people have said, essentially, I don't want to work where it's inflexible, dangerous, stressful, low paid, so they aren't, and they don't have to. And so we need, if we're going to recover some of the supply elasticity and not just rely on the central bank to hack the demand side of the economy down, to get rid of the original trigger for inflationary pressures, we need productivity growth. Now, I just spent a week here talking to a lot of people and government and researchers like all of you, and the situation here is completely different. There's in some there's a lot. You can find labor shortages in various skill categories, but you wouldn't characterize the Indian economy as sort of overall short of labor. So I think what will happen when this powerful tools are put in the hands of Indian entrepreneurs and technologists, they'll go after different problems, right? And so if they go after different problems, they probably won't go around automating a whole lot of stuff in a way that doesn't make sense. What I'm trying to say is the answer to this is context specific, right? You could probably produce a shortage of jobs if you systematically went out to do that. That is to allow the automation bias to run. My best guess is that that's not what's going to happen, but I can't prove it. I mean, the only other thing I would say is I focused on productivity because everybody understands that, and it happens to be matched to the conditions in the developed country. James and I did. But a lot of the impact in dimensions that matter to people is going to come elsewhere. You know, effectiveness of healthcare, longevity, quality of education, you know, it goes on and on. Because it really is hard to find a place where you can't find the footprint of this kind of thing. So, I don't know. If I'm wrong, I'll come back in 5 years and tell you I made a mistake.
So you use that phrase a couple of times, automation bias.
Yeah.
Are there ways around it? Are there regulatory structures? Are there incentives that can be built? Are there governance mechanisms by which you could reduce, eliminate the automation bias?
I think, so I doubt if you can eliminate it by regulation, but there are ways to have it dealt with. So in the interaction of management and everybody who works there, if labor has power, they'll push it in the direction of, you know, we have powerful tools, right? You know, or at least say we've got to avoid just going around hunting for our jobs and getting rid of as many as you can. And, you know, and when you implement technology change, the technologists can't do it by themselves. I mean, you probably, you know, in the business schools here have courses, you know, on implementing, you know, changes in business models and so on, which has lots of soft skills associated with it, lots of communication and whatnot, going back and forth, agreeing on the path forward. All of that could very well, you know, significantly modify a kind of initial bias in the direction of in the direction of automation. So I'm not too worried about it, but if you listen to the din right now in the popular press about this, you just can't get away from it. I mean, every second day there's an article in the Wall Street Journal about how dangerous this is in terms of white-collar jobs and whatnot. So, you know, I feel like Don Quixote, right? Sort of swiping away at windmills. But I'm pretty sure we'll settle down and get a sensible version of this.
So what are the risks that bother you most about AI?
So there are a lot. One is flooding the system with essentially rubbish, you know, that people have great difficulty distinguishing from real content. Now, and I'm not sure the market mechanisms, you know, brands and so on that we rely on and trust to kind of solve informational problems like that. I'm not sure they're powerful enough to work. And then it's just the misuse. So the first, internationally, this may sound crazy, this is not economics, but these technologies have enormously powerful uses in national security, warfare, defense, and so on. And the first thing I've heard people suggest we ought to do is, you know, have a treaty and basically agree we will never use a fully autonomous weapon so that there'll always be a human being somewhere. I mean, we're not there yet, but I mean, we're not that far away. Drones still have pilots, even if they're 5,000 miles away. That's some people worry about that. I think there's ways to misuse that, but we're talking about fully autonomous, ones that are out there making decisions about who's going to be killed and whatnot. I think we should just take that off the table, the way we took nuclear weapons and biological weapons and chemical weapons off the table. It's just too dangerous. So that'll be a start, and then, you know, then we'll inch our way forward. But there are lots of, you know, when copyright, there's a huge set of issues having to do with data. And they intersect the AI stuff, although they're not confined to that. So there's data security, privacy, the responsible use of data. But in addition, there's this, desire to be assured about it. So there's a proliferation of laws that basically say all the big data collections, like the mega platforms have to be resident in the country where the citizens about whom the data are. That's not very well put together sentence, is it? And that's fine. I understand that. We're going to physically locate the data here so we control, in some sense, or have more control over who has access to it. Global supply chains don't work very well because they're built on digital platforms, or increasingly they are, if you can't move data across the border, right? So there's a whole bunch of kind of quasi-practical issues that need to be dealt with, and that'll require international cooperation, maybe even new entities that we have to deal with. So it's quite a long list of things that could go wrong or cause an overreaction, and we'll miss the upside benefits.
So rubbish, data, warfare.
Warfare.
Rubbish, data, and warfare. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. If you were to look out 10 years, so you wanted to add to the list?
No, I was just saying rubbish, data, warfare. RDW. Okay.
So rubbish, data, warfare. So what do you think, seeing the trajectory that you've seen over the past 10 odd years, the chart that we had, what do you think in 10 years' time AI won't be able to do?
Well, so there's two great debates going on, at least two or three. One has to, if this is familiar to me, all of you just stop me. Down the road somewhere, there's this concept of artificial general intelligence. That means essentially an AI that's like a human in the kind of full-bore sense. And there's a debate going on about whether we'll ever get there. So when they ask the experts, they narrow in on somewhere between 10 years and never. That's a pretty big range. And then related to that, there's this notion that somewhere around down the road, again, there's an existential threat. When this machines start, sort of deciding what they're going to do and writing their own code and all that kind of thing. We're not there yet, but I guess I'm not, I don't have nightmares about it. On the other hand, I don't think we should just dismiss it, right? Although I tend to, this is slightly irresponsible, what I'm about to say, but I tend to think it's more interesting to think about, the path we're going to take to wherever we're going to get, rather than having a wildly, intense debate about what the world's going to be like 50 years from now, because who knows, right? It's kind of the attitude I have, and it may be a little bit, I'm overboard on that front. So those are two principal sort of areas of kind of, if you might call, really important systemic kind of risk associated with these things. And the other thing we don't know is, so ChatGPT had, a couple billion parameters. ChatGPT-4, I'm just picking on them. It could be Bard and now Gemini at Google. Several billion. I know they're going to do it again. Enormous amounts of computing power required to do this. You basically need the cloud computing platforms that the mega platforms have. What that means right now is all of them are in 2 countries, right? We don't have one in Europe where we can train these algorithms. We can use the AIs, but that's different from training them. So the academics, the researchers, who are building these algorithms are going to have at least some limitations. And then, of course, we're busy trying to make sure China doesn't get the chips that are the ones you really need to do the training. I don't think that'll slow them down very much, but that's, again, a judgment call. But so we go up this thing, we went ChatGPT, ChatGPT-4, many more parameters, huge amounts of computing power, and now we're going to do it again. So from your point of view, does this curve keep looking like an exponential? Or does it at some point, does it turn into an S-curve? And if it turns in, meaning eventually adding parameters doesn't give you much, This in economics is called diminishing returns, right? Kind of a familiar concept. So you get increasing returns and then diminishing returns. We don't even know if that's going to happen, or we'll just have an endless batch of increasing returns. And if we're going to get an S curve, we don't know when it's going to be, right? So that's a pretty big batch of uncertainty about how this is going to go in the future. So it's pretty clear what path we're going to go down, but we have no idea, I don't think, about how it's going to turn out.
Let me ask you a risk that worries me. I work with school education a lot. And, all of us are lazy thinkers. Most of us, not lazy thinkers, not people like you, but we are mostly lazy thinkers. And so, the natural tendency is for the student and for the teacher to say, like, ChatGPT, give me the lesson plan. Give me the homework, right? And you can guard against that. You can have more creative assignments. You can do all kinds of stuff. But I see a risk of getting into the habit of outsourcing thinking.
I think it's a real risk.
Outsourcing thinking itself.
Yep.
And therefore, you start losing the capacity to develop thinking. What do you think about that?
I agree with you. I think, there's a serious set of things we need to work through in academia together about what are the good and not so good uses of this. What I'm seeing is some people want it to go away while we figure it out, and other people want to, you have waded right in and say, I want you to use this stuff, but I want you to use it in with the following sort of conditions. One, you are able to defend what the thing delivers for you. Two, you disclose it. It's just like footnotes. Otherwise, it'll be plagiarism. And I suppose there's a kind of raging debate about how good the algorithms are for detecting, AI-generated content, when you hand in the term paper and so on. So we're not at the end of that. But I completely agree that you can hand in B+ papers in a lot of different courses without actually either doing the work or understanding the material, and that kind of defeats the purpose. So as educators, we're going to have to find a way around that. Maybe we're going to have to go back to tests where you're handed a little blue book, and you don't have your phone or your computer with you, and you actually have to sit down and answer a question that you weren't told about beforehand. Maybe. Not a bad idea.
Some of the old methods are the best.
Right.
Okay. So I'm going to move a little bit from AI. Permacrisis. Is that a word that you coined? No? I mean, it was the word of the year in 22 or 20?
Word of the year in 2022, so we borrowed it. There's polycrisis, permacrisis, etc. There's a whole bunch of words that are being invented to describe aspects of the evolving world we live in. So we had multipolar, and people didn't really want that. So now we have polyamorous, I can't remember. It's going on and on. But we picked permacrisis because it seemed for us to best capture the notion that we're having these three sets of things coming at us. Crises, shocks, and so on. Structural change underneath, that's not really captured in permacrisis, but we wanted to say that. Big changes requiring big changes in mindsets in the formulation of business strategy and policy, and then the fragmentation of the way the global economy is put together. I mean, to me, it was certainly the thing Gordon was most worried about, but I would not far behind him, is that world that we lived in, where basically the global economy was constructed on efficiency and comparative advantage considerations and almost nothing more. I mean, that's a bit of an oversimplification. We did have the Cold War and a bunch of other things, but that was mainly it. And then you got the emerging economy growth in a pretty benign environment. That world's just gone, right? We have national security significantly determining or overriding strictly economic considerations. You've got clear patterns of fragmentation. You have the tensions between China, the rising power. I don't know how we'll do with India, because you're a rising power too, and the incumbent, namely the United States. You've got just a much more complicated, even sometimes contradictory, business and economic environment. And so all we wanted to say is, we don't want this. One, we can't go back to where we came from. These are realities we have to deal with. But we don't have to just mindlessly go down the road of sort of nationalism, unilateralism, bilateralism, marginalize the multilateral institutions, especially when we need them for certain purposes. We can do this in a more kind of gradual and thoughtful way and still be pragmatic and realistic. I mean, I think if Gordon were here, he would call this globalization light, okay? That is, it's not the full-bore version we had, because we know we can't have that. And the other one is, there's nobody with any humility would say we can just fix this. There's no silver bullet. But we can avoid taking highly destructive steps in the wrong direction. I mean, there's lots of anomalies. Let me give an example. Rob Johnson and I talked about this. And Rob makes the point that, you can't explain and Montague Alawali makes the same point. You can't explain the current tariffs that the United States imposes on China in economic terms, right? Because they don't make sense. I mean, if it's true, we need to restrict the flow of semiconductors, and maybe we needed sanctions, although this is highly controversial and dangerous, as the response to the Ukraine-Russian conflict, with lots of negative long-run consequences to it. Trump put tariffs on everything, toys, textiles, you name it, and Biden didn't take them off. And you can't defend tariffs on toys on national security grounds. At least I haven't thought of a way to do it yet. And so the question is, why do we still have them? And the answer is political. It's got nothing to do with economics. The political answer in the American context is, in this environment, the only thing that the Republicans and Democrats really agree on is that China's bad news. And if you do something that's favorable to China, that's a bad thing to do politically. And so it hasn't been done, even though it makes full kind of economic sense. And a lot of people, I mean, it's not as if, everybody up there is stupid. Janet Yellen is not confused about this, and neither are a whole lot of other people. So it's just hard to move. It's the political reality.
You have a sort of a very pragmatic, approach that let's just do the common sense things right now, make the right choices. We don't know exactly where we're going on artificial intelligence or all the permacrisis, right? And that's a refreshing change, It's a refreshing change from people who seem to know exactly where we are going, right? And
I think this is an environment in which it's very hard to know where we're going. So, finding the right balance between finding a sense of direction and suggesting what might be a beneficial sense of direction without going overboard, and saying, we know stuff that we can't know is right. So take an example that we already talked about, and I'll just do it briefly. I think if we're going to get the benefits of AI, Gen AI, in the economy, we want it to be fairly inclusive. We should have flags up, for making sure we're moving in that direction everywhere, including here. I mean, I think it's going to happen here. I mean, just based on conversations I've had, and we want to make sure it diffuses across the economy just to get the productivity effect. But I can't get beyond that, other than to try to make a convincing case that sector by sector, that it looks like there's some very interesting things to do. There's, how do I say it? It's empirical, right? There's no theory that says AI will work in these areas and not in others. Anyway, yeah, so I think I probably sound more optimistic than many people, but that's, But it has a time horizon on it. I think the next little while in the global economy is going to be pretty tough. China will underperform for a while. Europe is really underperforming. We all are in the inflation fight. In America, we are in better shape in terms of overall macro performance, but are in desperately bad shape in distributional terms with, unknown but probably big negative consequences for political and social cohesion or polarization, its opposite. I'm sure you all know what the challenges are here, but I would say from an external point of view, the bright light in the next little while in terms of performance in the global economy is going to be India and some of the Asian countries. China will probably take about at least 2-3 years to kind of right the ship because of these imbalances are really very large. The real estate one, et cetera.
How are we doing on time? Time to open up? Maybe a couple of questions I can ask?
We should turn the lights up since I can't see anybody. Oh, good.
So, Mike.
Yes.
I was reading, I think you gave an interview. You were talking about the jobs issue in India.
Right.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So, what do you think about the issue of jobs in India? I mean, is Mike okay?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. So I think the good news is I said this publicly, so I'll just repeat it. I think the architecture in the digital economy that has been put in place, especially on the financial side, is the best in the world. And I think it's going to be exported, and there's now a growing batch of evidence that I became aware of that there's lots of interest in it. I don't mean India's going to build other people's infrastructure. I mean the open model with the UPI, and all of that is, I think, the right model and going to be replicated. China got there first in mobile payments before any of us, including the advanced countries. But that architecture, made two big private entities, the repository of all the data and therefore the ability to do the credit scoring and all that stuff. And that's not the model you want. And they were a threat to banks until they decided they weren't going to be, whereas this model basically takes the institutions there and voluntarily lets them in on a kind of level playing field. So I think it's a brilliant achievement. You have a burgeoning entrepreneurial ecosystem in multiple dimensions of the thing, partly because of the biometric identification system, partly because of this architecture, and a lot because the geo-revolution dramatically expanded the number of mobile internet users and the data rates. Now I'm telling people who are all mostly Indians, so it was something you already know. You went from the highest data rates to the lowest data rates in the world, almost overnight. And data rates really matter, right? So all of that looks terrific. So what do I mean by jobs? I do not think the overall growth dynamics yet have powerful enough employment engines in them to draw the vast majority of people who are in traditional sectors into the modern economy. I don't know what the answer is, but there is a distinct pattern of diversification in the global economy in response to shocks. Part of that diversification is away from China. So China's exiting faster than they normally would, just on the journey up the income scale. Apple now has 15% of their assembly here, with multiple entrepreneurs who built them elsewhere coming in to set up those operations. I think that's a good thing. It's not a permanent solution because in some areas, the digital technologies in manufacturing and assembly are pretty close to being better in terms of costs than the labor-intensive, process-oriented ones. And maybe electronics assembly is one of those areas. I would say textiles is still pretty hard because the machines, robots don't know how to handle cloth. It's a simple statement. Now, I've confirmed that. I've been asking people who've been trying to semi-automate the textiles and apparel industry, and they're working hard at it, and they believe they'll get there eventually. but they're not there yet. So I think that's one set of options. When people say, sort of, what's the answer? I say, I don't know. But when you have a lot of people to employ, you know, in a way that raises their productivity and is important part of the growth strategy, my answer to the question is, what should we do? The answer is sort of everything we can think of, right? Like, try this, try that, you know, and just get on with it. But I would say, in a pretty bright picture, I still think the model that says we've invented a completely different growth model. We can do it all on services. We don't really need the global economy that much. That's not a good strategy, is, I guess, the cautionary note. Fair enough?
Mm-hmm. You're signaling me to open it up. Yeah?
Yes.
All right, we'll open it up. And Mike, how would you like to do it? Would you like to take a question at a time or 3 questions together?
Well, you know, at my age, I can't remember a single question, let alone 3. So it depends. Well, let's try 3.
We'll start with 3.
Yeah, start with 3.
We'll start with 3. Okay, so can I see a show of hands, please?
Yeah.
So right at the back.
He has the mic already.
No, you can't do that. You can't hijack the mic.
Okay.
Oh, okay, she gave it to you.
He did have his.
Okay, please start with him. Please start with him. Then the mic can go back, you know.
There's a real challenge when your name is Mike. Anyway, carry on. Sorry.
Then Mike can go back, and then Mike can come here.
Yeah, right.
Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you for the talk, Professor. I run a company where we combine professional education and work in one platform. I'm curious to know what your views on professional education and credentialing is going forward, given how things are changing with AI, and any advice you might have for educators, for policymakers on education and credentialing, especially for vocational jobs in mind.
Okay, that's fair.
Right at the back?
Signaling.
Right at the back, yes. Signaling. Yes, can I see the third hand?
I think a very similar question to the one that the gentleman just raised. There were a couple of things that I just wanted to echo, though. One was that Anurag said AI has the potential to make people unable to think.
Unable to think. Right?
Yeah, I mean,
right.
if writing and reading are a big
Yeah.
way that we do that now, there's no need. And also it raises the median kind of skill level to where AI can support. So in your example, the ones who are doing really poorly now have this level, but maybe there's some people who still kind of can cross that. I guess those 2 trends, how do you see them? How do you see them playing out in the educational system? And what are the things that we can do to prepare as a workforce to deal with those outcomes?
Right.
All right, the lady there.
Good evening, Anurag and Professor Spence. It's a delight to welcome you back to India and to Bangalore.
Thank you.
And it was a fascinating talk, and a Nobel Prize winning economist speak like a computer scientist, and I really enjoyed it. Not that I followed everything that you said, but I really appreciated the positive aspects of AI that you highlighted. Because today I read that even Sam Altman talked about regulating AI, right? So I'm sure you know a lot of the problems that developing countries like India face. Like, I'm an urban economist, so many things like sanitation and solid waste management. We begin with Alexa, Siri, voice assistants, and maybe some artificially intelligent robots. And there are some restaurants in Bangalore which use robots to serve customers.
Yep.
And remote homes, smart homes. Can we use each of these applications? Can you find some interesting applications for developing cities like Bangalore or some other cities in India where we can experimentally use AI to increase productivity, as the case may be? Thanks a lot, and I'll catch up with you later.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Mike.
Terrific. So I think, AI is not going to take out what you might call a signaling or credentialing effect. In your elite institutions, the competition's strenuous. that essentially means that people who hire those folks are going to hire them knowing that they're in a different part of the distribution than any other place. And I don't see an obvious application of AI that changes that. It may be that, however, AI will have an important role in accelerating and making more precise and effective, the training of specific skills, right? And that would be moving down a road that we're already on, which is, it's just, they may be better at it once people kind of figure out how to do it. I believe there's some work going on there. Earlier today, we were looking at some experimental work that's designed to have a big impact in the part of the population whose education is deficient, even to the point of, being illiterate. And it looks that's not a done deal, but it's promising. On the educational side, I think in the end, the only way to go, other than, being clear about what the rules and values are, is to convince ourselves and students that the purpose of being here is not getting good grades and passing tests. It's learning stuff. I mean, let me give you an example. And this is, in the category of we don't know when you're really serious about it. But AIs basically pick up patterns, right? So suppose you're in a period of structural change and you're in the investment world, and those patterns aren't going to hold in the future. Only you know it, right? Then you have to be able to think constructively about what's changing, even if it's a little fuzzy, in order to adapt to that environment. The best investors that I know are people who do that. Identify the fact that the world is changing in ways that are material, so that the mindsets that you develop when you live in a low inflation world, or, a world that's not changing very fast, even if things are happening, that long and deflationary period, with EM growth driving it is an example of that. And I think what we should do is convince the students that there's a great deal of power in that. An AI is not, thus far anyway, going to do something truly original. It'll manipulate things. It does, there's a risk of overstating this. They do hallucinate and produce things that, don't exist. And some of them are pretty interesting. So when I asked James, what reaction do you get from the creative community? And he said, well, I thought they'd be upset because, the AIs would be doing what they do. And instead, what I found is not uniformly, but a common opinion was, no, I get new ideas that I wasn't getting before from the AIs making stuff up. And some of it's actually pretty interesting. Anyway, bottom line is the way I would deal with that is, is to go back to the really fundamentals about why we're here and what we're trying to do with an education, and just stay focused on that. Don't try to skate through, with minimum effort and the maximum input from these tools. There's two answers I want to give to this. I think, AI is going to have an important role in the energy transition. It's going to have a tremendously important role in energy efficiency, monitors systems, adapts them kind of very quickly and fast, probably a component of smart grids and all that kind of thing that we're going to have. This is a little esoteric, but robotics is a really interesting area. So people wave their hands and think robotics is moving along on the same train. It's not. The robotics is important, but robots so far, think broadly, including autonomous vehicles, work pretty well in structured environments. This is the analog of a restricted domain in AI. Why? Because the parameters they have to understand to navigate in a physical, this is the world that the tech people call atoms, not bits, right? Bits is information, atoms is where we live. Because the parameters that define how much variation there is are small. If you take a a robot of any kind into an environment they haven't seen before that doesn't have a limited number of parameters, as in a manufacturing facility or a fulfillment center, then they start to get lost because there's too much variation and they don't process it very well. You don't think about this, but you have, by the time you're 5, as a human being, the ability to process incredibly complex and visual and other environments that are evolving quickly, so they're moving with no latency, which means no delay, right? And there's a good reason why there's no delay as an evolutionary matter. If you're about to be eaten by a dinosaur, you probably want to know it before, without having a 5-second delay. And so robots aren't even remotely close to having that capability, which means they cannot be fully autonomous in unstructured environments, and we're not close to making them that. So they need human assistance. And it may be that the road we go down, all this isn't much talked about, is that if we want the robots to be assisting us, in restaurants, there's probably just enough structure that they can function in that environment, that we have robots assisting us, but the things they're weak at, which they can't do yet, this processing of complex environments, will help them, right? I mean, if I have somebody who's, let me give a specific example. Every economy has lots of buildings, and all of those buildings have people who come in and clean them every night. Robots can't do that job by themselves on a fully autonomous basis. They'll trip, they'll fall, et cetera. They're enough unstructured that it's not going to work. No, it's not permanent condition. Sometime down the road, somebody will figure out how to solve this problem, but that's kind of where we are now. So that, I think, puts parameters around the way in which some of the digital technologies are or are not going to be able to do things in an urban environment. So, for example, the autonomous vehicles are running into problems. Cruise, which I believe is General Motors, autonomous vehicle program was just shut down in San Francisco because they kept having problems, right? What are the problems? Well, they drive into a pile of cement because they didn't realize it was wet, or they ran over somebody, or somebody moved something, and they have a map, and the map's out. You should know these vehicles, because they don't have the ability I just described to you, have detailed maps in every city they're allowed to operate in their memory. And those maps are so detailed they make Google Maps look like a crayon drawing, right? I mean, every fire hydrant, et cetera. And that's the only way they can function. And even then, they're challenged, right? There's emergency, if the fire department shows up, everybody has to stop. They've got them programmed to stop. And then the firemen, or women, have to tell the drivers what to do to get out of the way. It's an emergency situation, hadn't been pre-programmed. There's nobody to talk to. They have to phone up crews and say, could you get somebody down here to get these cars out of the way? Right. Do you see what I'm talking about, right? So the world's a pretty complex place, and the fully digital things, have a ways to go before they navigate very well.
Can I see the next set of 3 hands? Yeah, lots of hands. So I'll just point out, whoever's handling the mic, I'll point out the 3 people. Huh? So we will start with the gentleman in red there. Then the gentleman there at the back. Yeah. And here. Okay.
Sir, very good evening. We don't see much AI deployed in mitigation of climate crisis. So your comments on that one. Thank you.
Okay, climate, yep.
Climate crisis. Yeah. I'm just trying to be equitable, in passing the mic around. Otherwise, front bench is always, yeah.
Hi. Somebody said hi.
Oh, hello.
Oh, there you are.
Hi. You mentioned this a little bit, but I just wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on how can we prevent AI systems from being deployed by like governments and militaries. It doesn't look like nuclear just because we have like ChatGPT level open source models right now in like 7 months from when ChatGPT came out that everyone has access to. So it doesn't look like nuclear. Do you think like policy would be good enough for this or no?
Yeah.
Good question.
Here.
Thank you, Anurag. Hello, Professor. Big fan of your work. I'm Madan from Accenture, Managing Director with Accenture. Just a question. In the recent discourse of the past 2-3 months, we've kind of seen a narrative of effective acceleration to accelerate AI technologies and see where it goes. Mark Andreessen and others have kind of pushed for this. And on the other side, you have DeepMind. You spoke of DeepMind, Mustafa Suleyman, Nick Bosworth. Academicians are asking for regulation. So where do you think this will actually land with the government and authorities? And selfishly, how will it pan out for the management consulting industry?
That's a good question. Well, let me take that one first. So I think we'll go down the middle. So I don't think Mark Andreessen will, succeed in, making this all good and hands off. On the other hand, I tend to be sympathetic to being enthusiastic about the upside potential in a way that may not be reflected in the general discourse. But I'm for sure with Sam Altman and others, that we're going to have regulation. Now, whether that satisfies the people who think this is, truly kind of at a deeper level dangerous, people like Jeff Hinton may. Jeff was one of the founders of the neural network version of artificial intelligence at the University of Toronto, was advisor to Google. He stepped down at Google so he could speak freely about this as Google played catch up with OpenAI and so on. And so these are serious people, serious ethical people who are voicing their concerns in an important part of the debate. And where we're going to end up, I'm not sure. But the unregulated version, I think, is extremely unlikely, especially if you look at it globally. Europeans have already decided that's not what we're going to do, or they're going to do, and et cetera. So I think it's pretty clear. Now, what the balance comes out as, I'm not sure. Let's see. We wanted to talk about climate change. Now, that's a small subject. So I decided to focus. So where we are in climate change, where we are in climate change, briefly. We are fighting a battle having come late to the game. I don't think we can be too optimistic at the moment. Global gross production-based emissions are about 38 billion tons a year. That's about 3 times or more what we need to be even within shooting distance of something that's stable. If you look around the world, China will probably peak, and China is now the biggest single source by country of CO2 emissions, for sure. It will peak before 2030. Now, peaking is fine, but if you're going to meet the kind of interim targets that you hear from the IPCC or the International Energy Agency, peaking is not enough. You got to kind of go down pretty fast. We're not going to make it, I don't think, on the 1.5 degrees Celsius interim targets. We'll blow the carbon budget associated with that in the course of this decade, I would imagine. Just because the alternative scenarios have the carbon intensity of the global economy coming down so fast, it's just unbelievable. I did a calculation a couple of years ago that the carbon intensity of the global economy would, on conservative assumptions about growth, would have to come down at something like 5 or 6% a year, which isn't even vaguely related to what the recent past. Maybe it's come down at 1% or 2% a year, but that's an enormous difference between that and 6 or 7. So, and that number gets higher, the higher global growth is, right? So you know this in India because, you know, you have, I'm sure you'll be a serious part of the, you know, the climate agenda, but there's a ton of growth coming, right? And so if you were going to counter that growth in India, you see what I'm saying? I mean, Europe's not going to grow very much, so, you know, you're not running a race against growth in Europe. You're just coming down at whatever pace you can accomplish, and Europe's pretty serious about this. In America, we're in the game. I don't know what will happen if the electoral results are different, you know, down the road, but we could change direction again. But in India, when you're growing at 7%, you know, if your emissions are going to come down, then the carbon intensity of the economy has to come down at a tremendously high rate. So I think a reasonable prediction is that can't happen, right? You're just going to be part of the world that's growing fast, and that's fair because we grew before. And, you know, we're going to have to compensate for it, you know, somewhere else because your emissions are going to come up under any reasonable scenario, even if you have an intense program of building incremental electricity generating capacity with green energy sources and so on. So you got China, you got India, you've got the United States and Europe. Europe's outperforming in this dimension. The United States is coming down, but it started so high, it's sort of embarrassing. I mean, we were at 20 tons a person, you know, back 10 or 15 years ago. We're probably down to 15 now, so I don't know. That's a kind of thumbnail sketch. The good news is people take it seriously and aware. When I did the Growth Commission work with, you know, some of your colleagues and others around the world 15, 20 years ago, 15, say, you know, I would say the general level of awareness and, you know, about the seriousness of the problem was pretty low in various parts of the world. That's not true now, so that's kind of a necessary condition for getting on with it. But, you know, we got a lot of work to do. And I'm sure we're going to have a fair amount of climate change, and you can see it coming, you know, in the increasing frequency and severity of shocks, and they're everywhere, on every continent now. That's a reality we're going to, that was part of the permacrisis kind of, you know, picture, if you like. What was the question about?
Deployment by governments.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's a very good question. So in order to make accelerate its use, they've made it widely available, and they've got APIs, so you can build proprietary use cases and apps on top of it, and that's fine. But then the question is that you're asking, I think, is, you know, so yeah, what's the regulation? Do you just shut them down? I think the regulation is going to have to go in the direction of monitoring and prevent, you know, essentially disallowing misuse. This is very uncomfortable. Some of it has to do with data. So we will have some attempt at some point to deal with this copyright question. We can't have somebody hoovering up everything that's ever been written in history that's in digital form and then writing their own stuff without further comment. This is not going to work. So that one I think we can make some progress on. And then the thing that's uncomfortable in America, and I think many other countries, is in our governance structures and constitutional setup, there is no natural entity that has the authority to declare something so, you know, destructive that it should be eliminated when it comes to speech, right? There's enormous variances across countries. And I imagine that's probably a bit of a problem here. In China, it's not a problem at all. The Chinese Communist Party is the authority in that system, and if they think it's not helpful, then it's, you know, they just take it out, period. So I don't know how we're going to come out on that, but I don't think it's a fatal flaw that that Gen AIs are widely available. I mean, I don't think it means you can't make any progress on regulation.
Spence, what he's also referring to is what's possible in terms of controlling its deployment in warfare?
Oh, in warfare.
Military, yeah.
Oh, no, then you need treaties. You got to sit down. And I guess there's no guarantees, but we do have treaties, and we did manage after World War II not to use nuclear weapons. So you don't see too much use of biological weapons. It's harder in the digital area because there's non-state actors who have a greater ability to do bad stuff than probably in other areas. I mean, there are not too many hacking groups that have a nuclear weapon tucked away, to be a little bit facetious about it. So it's not easy, and we haven't done it yet. But I would say the same thing about cybersecurity. If it is clearly true that offense is always going to outrun the defense, and the offense is going to include the capacity, if they decide to do it, essentially to bring down the entire infrastructure, architecture, the entire electrical grid, et cetera. I think the best defense against that is to say we're not going to do that. And then sign treaties that say that and ostracize anybody who violates those principles. Because there are incredibly destructive things that could be. You could, for example, in principle, you could go put there was a fiction book written by Bill Clinton and Patterson, I think. Somebody put a hard-to-detect bit of code in a system that was designed to blow up and destroy all the data. And the backup systems didn't work because the code was in the backup systems as well. Right? If you destroy all the data, in an economy that's built on basically digital foundations, you've got pretty serious trouble. So anyway, I think those things, the only way to deal with those things is to sit down and understand that they're devastating and we're not just going to go there.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. So on behalf of BIC and APU, I'd like to thank Michael Spence for his presentation. I'd like to thank Anurag for the interlocution and Arjun for their introduction. Thank you all of you for being here.